This is CGTN, China Global Television Network.
Emergency operations continue at the scene of a factory fire in the Sudanese capital, which has left over 20 people dead. More on the serious consequences of global warming, with flooding still causing havoc across a number of African countries. And how one South African artist is making an impact, one piece at a time. Hello and a very warm welcome to Africa Live on CGTN. I'm Lindy Mtongana in Nairobi. Also coming up this hour, the third CGTN Global Media Summit and CCTV Plus Video Media Forum opens in Beijing. And the status of the fight against malaria and why sub-Saharan Africa has reason to smile. In our top story, a new report has highlighted the devastating impact pollution is having on human health. This comes as the United Nations Climate Change Conference is underway in Madrid. Our correspondent Guy Henderson has more from the Spanish capital.
The pollution pod on the sides of the UN Climate Summit.
So you're going actually into New Delhi, yeah, which actually is the most polluted city on the world.
An installation not depicting some future scenario. This is how millions of people are living now.
And it's acidic, isn't it? It's a different air quality.
The health implications are startling.
We're working with the World Health Organization, and they've identified air pollution as a really significant world health threat. And also that city air pollution is directly linked to climate change. And that is the big one we get across. If you cure and clean up our cities, you're doing a lot of going towards actually cleaning up, the climate change gases that affect us.
Benefits that you will obtain.
The UN released its first ever report on the impact of climate change on human health here on Tuesday. It says millions of people are already dying.
The emissions that are responsible for climate change are somehow as well very much responsible for air pollution, and therefore for the 7 million premature deaths that we have every year. And this is the strongest connection, because if we tackle the causes of climate change, imagine the possibility of reducing 7 million deaths.
The report outlines a broad range of health challenges linked to global warming. On the one hand, saying how more floods, forest fires, droughts can lead to immediate casualties, but also looking more long-term to the spread of disease or the damage to health infrastructure caused by such natural disasters. The impact of food and water shortages more generally. It also talks about the consequences for mental health. Governments aren't doing enough, the WHO warns, and it's often poorer countries that are least equipped to cope. Air quality, though, is its number one concern. For some here, that means phasing out fossil fuels as quickly as possible.
Either we stop this addiction to coal, or all our efforts to tackle climate change will be doomed.
Others say cheap energy like coal can still play a role in lifting millions out of poverty, another pressing health issue. China, the world's largest coal producer, says fossil fuels themselves are not the problem.
The problem is we emit the greenhouse gas into the air. That is the problem. If we can control the emission, the coal is not a problem.
Carbon capture?
Yes, okay. Maybe.
You go from one city to the other. And
everyone here knows that without action soon we may be heading for a climate disaster. The world is still divided over what exactly that action should be. Guy Henderson, CGTN, Madrid.
Well, let's go live now to Madrid and get an update on what is happening at the ongoing UN Climate Conference. We're joined by CGTN's Filio Cantrofuri. Filio, of course, today lots of excitement surrounding activist Greta Thunberg at the UN Climate Conference. What more can you tell us about this?
Well, that's right, and Greta Thunberg's presence here is highly anticipated. and she is expected to be one of the stars of this UN climate conference. And you know, when there was this last-minute announcement that the conference is moving from Chile to Spain here in Madrid, one of the questions, at least among journalists and activists and many others, was, will Greta make it to the summit? Well, after spending almost 3 weeks crossing the Atlantic Ocean, Greta arrived in Portugal, in Lisbon, yesterday with a sailboat, and she is expected here in Madrid in the next couple of days. She's also expected to take part at a climate march and protest that will be taking place here on Friday. And of course, what everybody is expecting is that moment when Greta Thunberg will be giving one of those theory speeches that she's used to giving right here at the UN conference. Now, Greta Thunberg, who, you know, as we know, is this a young 16-year-old Swedish climate activist that has become a global icon in the last year. She has made headlines even before her expected arrival here in Madrid, just by opting to come with a sailboat. She's a person that said, you know, she's opting not to use air travel so that she doesn't, she doesn't harm the environment from all the emissions from the plane. And that's something that has been praised by a lot of people. And she said that she didn't do that, so, you know, expecting other people to start traveling the way she does. But she did it to send a message and show that, you know, we cannot keep living as unsustainably as we have been. So, you know, Greta Thunberg is a person that has inspired millions across the globe. She is the person that has also inspired a global youth movement in the fight against climate change. And it is a movement that has been praised by UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres right here in Madrid, and also even Chile's Environment Minister, who is presiding over this conference. She openly praised Greta Thunberg, and she called her a leader able to move and open hearts across the globe. This is the first global UN conference taking place after this big global youth movement against climate change. So the question is if moving hearts and changing hearts and minds here will translate into also a change of policy. Back to you in the studio.
Well, indeed, Greta has proven to be quite a force to be reckoned with. Thank you so much, Filio Kantrufuri, joining us there live from Madrid. Now, indeed, one of the effects of extreme weather linked to climate change has been severe flooding, and we've seen quite a lot of that in a number of African countries. Here in Kenya, at least 132 people have been victims of heavy rains. Bodies are still being recovered in the West Pokot region, which was hit by landslides.
Victims of the landslides in West Pokot County in northwestern Kenya are reeling from the devastation from the rains pounding the region.
Person buried here is my mother-in-law. When we woke up, we found that the water was almost removing the coffin from the grave. So we took big stones and placed them on top of the grave to protect the coffin and avoid losing the body.
Effects from the landslides continue to be felt.
We don't have farms to cultivate, and even our cows were taken away by the flood waters, so we have a big problem.
Floods continue to wreak havoc across the wider East African region. In Tanzania, at least 10 people drowned early on Saturday when they were swept away by a torrential river. Violent downpour has also displaced 500,000 people in Somalia. In neighboring South Sudan, whole towns have been submerged with close to 1 million people affected and at risk of starvation. Meanwhile, dozens have been killed in flash floods and landslides in Ethiopia. The extreme weather is blamed on the climate system defined by the difference in the sea surface temperature between the western and eastern areas of the ocean. Kenya's Meteorological Department has forecast more heavy rain in the coming days. Beryl Oro, CGTN.
Economic data out of the country. The country's foreign currency reserves.
With a dedicated and diverse team of anchors, CGTN now brings Africa to the palm of your hand.
I'm Penina Karibe in the heart of Nairobi, which is bustling.
From everyday heroes to the continent's most powerful figures. we bring their voices to you.
We haven't changed.
And this is something most of us are very excited about.
We bring you news that's changing perspectives.
Reporting from Nairobi City Center.
News that brings Africa to the world. CGTN. See the difference.
Divisions and tensions are hanging over the NATO summit as world leaders gather in London to mark the alliance's 70th anniversary. CGTN's Richard Bestick has more from London.
This summit's meant to be all about celebrating 70 years of NATO, the biggest and longest lasting military alliance in history. The reality? It's been a day of meetings in the fringes aimed at easing the stresses and strains within the organisation. As well as a series of bilateral meetings, there was the sound of clinking raised glasses in Downing Street and at a grand reception here at Buckingham Palace. But you know you've got a problem when the leaders of two of the most powerful NATO members get into a spat over whether the alliance is, quote, strategically brain dead, referring, of course, to Turkey's incursion into Kurdish-controlled Syria.
Would you like some nice ISIS fighters?
Look, if you look at the situation,
you can take everyone you want.
Let's be serious. For me, the very first objective in the region is to finish war against ISIS. And don't make any mistake. Your number one problem are not the foreign fighters. This is the ISIS fighters in the region. And you have more and more of these fighters due to the situation today.
This is why he's a great politician, because that was one of the greatest non-answers I've ever heard. And that's okay.
The 29 NATO leaders move their summit to the countryside for the next stage, but their round table talks will be kept to a minimum. No joint communique is expected. All this designed to eliminate the potential for further family rows. Discussion of NATO's longer-term strategic goals are, it seems, for another day. Richard Bestick, CGTN, London.
Well, let's get more now on that NATO summit. We're live with CGTN's Phil Lavelle in London. Phil, of course, this is the meeting, well, the summit is the meeting of the world's most powerful defense alliance, celebrating its 70th anniversary. Tell us, though, why this particular summit is so crucial.
Well, that is part of it, the fact that NATO is now 70 years old. This is an event that happens pretty much most years, where you get leaders from those 29 member nations getting together to talk about NATO's role. So, of course, now there will be a period of reflection, what NATO has achieved, but also they have to look to the future, how NATO will continue to operate, how NATO will continue to stay relevant. And they've got a lot to talk about. Various issues on the agenda, from Russia and Vladimir Putin's role on the global stage, to China's astronomical growth, how NATO members deal with that, to terrorism. Remember, we're in a city that is no stranger to terrorist attacks. We saw one just a few days ago. In fact, France's President Emmanuel Macron says that terrorism is probably the greatest threat to NATO. We're also going to be hearing about space security, security up in the skies, cyber security. That is a big issue for the United States. And of course, Donald Trump's favourite subject, spending, because he has been a long-time critic of NATO. The way NATO works is the fact that every member nation has to commit to spending 2% of its GDP, its gross domestic product, on defence. Now, Donald Trump has long said that the US plays its part, but a lot of the countries within NATO, the majority of whom are European, do not, and therefore the United States is effectively bankrolling European safety. During his election campaign back in 2016, he described NATO as being obsolete. He's alluded to the fact that the United States could pull out. In fact, John Bolton, who was his national security advisor until a few months ago before he was sacked, recently said that he thinks Donald Trump will pull out if he is elected next year. So although this is a celebration, an anniversary, don't expect a huge celebratory atmosphere in there. It is down to business, and there are not many smiles there, at least not at the moment.
Well, that is rather worrying, especially as you say that there are some major issues on the agenda. Certainly these tensions within the alliance aren't helping the situation.
No, not at all. I mean, as I said, Donald Trump obviously is a critic of NATO. Then you've got Emmanuel Macron. You know, the two of them sat together yesterday in London, and you could have cut the atmosphere with a knife, because Emmanuel Macron has said recently that he thinks NATO is, quote, strategically brain dead. Donald Trump referred to those comments as nasty and insulting in his usual quite direct approach. And that is because there is also the issue of Turkey, which is a NATO member. You remember just in October we had the situation where US troops were pulled out of northern Syria and Turkish forces moved in for their assault against what they described as terrorists. Now, this was a deal that was brokered between the US and Turkey, both NATO members, but other NATO countries felt they had not been informed, that they were being effectively disrespected. Nobody had told them that this was going to happen. On top of that, you had Russia move in to help the Kurds, which effectively meant at one point Turkish troops could have come into contact, could have come into an altercation with Russian forces. Under NATO rules, if you attack one NATO country, you attack them all. So there was a very real chance that Turkish forces, i.e. all of NATO, could have been up against Russia, and you don't need me to elaborate to tell you what that could have meant for world security. So there is that huge issue there, and that is one thing that the Turks and the Americans and the French and all the NATO leaders do not agree on. So that is one big issue that they're going to be talking about here today.
A tough one indeed. Well, thank you so much, Phil Lavelle, joining us there live from London. Well, staying in London, of course, that NATO summit is underway. The UK Prime Minister currently addressing that summit. Let's listen in.
Democracy, to their jobs, homes, schools and hospitals would not be secure and could not flourish without the peace that NATO is designed to guarantee. But history shows that peace cannot be taken for granted. And even as we celebrate this anniversary, we must ensure that our deeds match our words. And the atrocity in London last Friday shows why we must work together to combat terrorism and the vital importance of NATO's missions to counter this threat. For the UK's part, we spend over 2% of our GDP on defence. We are proud to be making the biggest contribution of any European ally to NATO's readiness initiative by offering an armoured brigade, 2 fighter squadrons and 6 warships, including the Royal Navy's new aircraft carriers. As friends and allies, we must never shy away from discussing new realities, particularly NATO's response to emerging threats like hybrid warfare and disruptive technologies, including space and cyber. At this Council, we have the opportunity to strengthen the unity of purpose that has made NATO the greatest and most successful alliance in history, and to take the new steps that are profoundly necessary to ensure another 70 years of peace and security.
Well, those live images there coming from London. UK Prime Minister Boris Johnson addressing the NATO summit, reiterating the UK's support, continued support for NATO, talking about the need, though, to assess some new realities, new challenges that are facing that defence alliance. Now let's turn to security matters on the continent. The Eastern Africa Standby Force says it's ready to deploy peacekeepers in areas prone to conflict within the region. To keep track of security threats, member states are currently meeting in Uganda's capital, Kampala. CGTN's Hilary Ayesiga reports.
Finding a solution to security threats on the African continent. Eastern African security chiefs brainstorm on how to keep the region safe.
We understand in our secretariat, without peace and security, there is no social development economic.
The force was established 15 years ago to maintain peace and security in the region. Security chiefs here say at the end of the 4-day meeting, they will have developed an action plan to keep the region safe. But this will require funding and cooperation from partner states. 10 member states subscribe to the regional peace mechanism. However, tensions among some members are threatening the coalition.
Even as we may fight or may not fight, we are saying that through this East African kind of understanding, nobody will be supporting one other, the end of the fighting countries or end of the conflicting countries, other than helping them to get out of the conflict.
Security chiefs are now encouraging leaders to use diplomacy to keep the region calm. Hilary Isga, CGTN, Kampala.
Well, meanwhile, more civilian casualties are being reported from Libya. The Eastern LNA forces have been intensifying their attacks over the capital Tripoli this week. On Monday, the UN-recognized government of National Accord says at least 17 civilians have been killed, most of them children. Here's CGTN's Adel Al-Mahraoui with more.
Reports of airstrikes over civilian sites in the Libyan capital Tripoli are continuing to flow. After declaring a no-fly zone over the government of National Accord-based city, General Khalifa Haftar's forces were expected to escalate. It appears this week they had more incentive to speed up their mission to take over Tripoli.
That evident spike in attack follows GNA's agreement with Turkey over water borders, which irritated Haftar's allies, including Egypt. So Haftar speeding up his mission to seize control over the capital in response. He's fighting Islamist militias there, and his mission has taken so long, he wants to show his allies that he can make progress.
On Monday, the government of National Accord said at least 17 civilians have been killed in airstrikes, among them 12 children. They've also announced that the recent attacks targeted a hospital.
The political solution in Libya has frozen and is almost entirely dead. The Secretariat agreement has been neglected. A political process can begin if the military operations end, and that's almost impossible to happen. Many countries are interfering and they are supporting the rebel parties in Libya. That complicates the situation. I don't think either sides in Libya want the war to stop. Haftar's increased pressure over the capital is primarily the reason why no political solution is imminent.
General Khalifa Haftar's LNA forces are classifying most Islamist militias backing their rival government in Tripoli as terrorists. Since April, they've begun a campaign to seize control of the capital Tripoli to marginalize these groups. As the war over Tripoli intensifies, it is expected that more civilian casualties will fall. Unfortunately, it only diminishes the success rate of any future talks between the rival Libyan factions. Adel Al-Mahraoui, CGTN, Cairo.
Let's turn to news coming from Sudan now. Rescue workers are still searching for victims at the scene of a fire in the north of the capital. A fire broke out after a gas tanker exploded while unloading at a ceramics factory. At least 23 people were killed and dozens injured. Victims include employees of various nationalities.
It is still unclear what caused this fire at a tile manufacturing unit in an industrial zone of North Khartoum. Rescue workers struggled to put out the inferno. More than 20 people have been killed and dozens are nursing injuries. For some workers, it was sheer luck.
When the fire happened, we were near the factory. We went out for breakfast and felt a quake. We tried to enter, but we were surprised by the fire. All the workers rushed and fled the scene of the fire.
We came back again and the fire was very strong, and then it calmed down a little. So we entered and we started to take out the bodies. All the bodies were burnt by gas.
Preliminary reports from the scene indicate that necessary safety equipment was missing at the site. The cause of the fire is under investigation, but authorities have this to say.
One of the gas tanks in the factory exploded, either as a result of not having been connected on the ground or as a result of a technical error. But it is safe to say that a technical error occurred in the way that the gas is released, which led to the explosion of the tanker.
Officials also say the presence of inflammable materials improperly stored led to the spread of the fire. Chamgono, CGTN.
How will your world change today? What happens here? What happens there? Or what you make happen for yourself? If it matters to you, it matters to us too. Your stories are the stories that need to be told. Africa Live. Find your voice.
The World Health Organization says community involvement in malaria control and prevention in sub-Saharan Africa has increased significantly in recent years. An estimated 61% of pregnant women and children slept under an insecticide-treated net in 2018. That's 35% more compared to 2010. The two groups are also benefiting from preventative medicine for malaria. The WHO recommends these strategies to reduce cases and deaths across the region, but progress has stalled in countries hardest hit by malaria. Inadequate funding remains a major barrier to progress. Last year, the disease killed over 400,000 people, mostly in sub-Saharan Africa.
Shortcoming that it is the first time that the World Malaria Report focuses on malaria in pregnant women and children, because they are the two main target groups, the two population groups that carry the brunt of disease. By highlighting it in this year's World Malaria Report, we hope it also helps drive the attention of the countries, of the funders, as this must be our #1 priority. It is a critical step, reducing disease and death in children and pregnant women towards elimination. It's an ethically imperative to ensure that no one dies of this disease that is preventable and entirely curable, and children and pregnant women carry a disproportionate burden of this disease.
Well, let's go to Rwanda now for an update on the ongoing international conference on AIDS and sexually transmitted infections in Africa. ICASA is the largest gathering on HIV/AIDS on the African continent and brings together stakeholders in collaborative response efforts. CGTN's Wokista Nyaba is live with us now. Wokista, what are the key highlights of the ICASA sessions on Wednesday?
Thank you, Lindy. Well, on the third day, we are seeing delegates just delving deeper into some of those barriers to the prevention of HIV, as well as the treatment and management of HIV and AIDS. And today we are seeing they're discussing a number of issues, including the fact that the infection rates among adolescent girls and young women remains very high, that this group is disproportionately affected, and that a lot of new infections are seen among adolescent girls and young women. And so they are discussing and engaging even with some of these representatives of these young people to just find out where the issues are, what are some of the interventions that they should be putting in place, and how can they address that so that they can see new infections come down within this group. But some of the issues they're also looking at are other interventions, not just for the young girls and the women, but also issues such as voluntary male medical circumcision as a way to prevent transmission of HIV and AIDS. So these are some of the discussions that continue here that just try to speak about very specific challenges and how to tackle them. Lindy.
Wokista, when it comes to interventions, what are some of the innovative approaches that are being developed to get treatment to those people that are living with HIV in Africa?
Well, Lindy, one of the things that delegates here have spoken extensively about is the fact that in order to have a world free of AIDS, two of the things that are very important are to identify the persons living with HIV and AIDS, and to also ensure that they have antiretroviral treatment. And therefore, one of the discussions that has really generated quite a bit of excitement was one session where speakers were talking about just having a long-lasting antiretroviral treatment. For example, an injectable antiretroviral treatment that would be taken maybe once every 4 weeks or once every 8 weeks. Because one of the challenges that has been seen is even after patients have been put on antiretroviral treatment, that after a while there is some fatigue in taking drugs, and that this does affect adherence. So let us have a look at this report on some of these particular issues and this particular innovation.
For millions of people living with HIV and AIDS, antiretroviral medication can actually be a dose of life. The treatment means they can lead normal, healthy lives. But after decades on medication, scientists note that fatigue is setting in, and many HIV patients struggle with the drugs which have to be taken at the very same time every single day for the rest of their lives.
For chronic diseases such as HIV, you always have challenges to take medications over and over. So, for example, if you've been on antibiotics just for 7 days, many people will tell you that they have forgotten like 2 days on their medicine. So imagine if you take medicine for 20 years and you have to take a pill every day. So plus the side effects of those medications.
That's where the idea of the injectable antiretroviral medication comes in, a discussion which brought researchers together at the ongoing International Conference on AIDS and STIs in Africa. The idea is to formulate a long-acting drug that can be injected in regular intervals of 4 to 8 weeks, giving patients a reprieve in between. It is technology that is closer than ever, as 2 pharmaceutical companies have submitted 2 drugs, cabotegravir and rilpivirine, for testing and approval. The combination of these 2 antiretrovirals has been shown to be just as effective as daily oral therapy, but the injectables are yet to be approved for general use, and researchers warn that even if the drugs pass every test, it could take up to 5 years before they are accessible to the public.
And this one is actually reaching the last stage, which is like pre-market. And there you can say, oh, I see it is coming. That's why the idea of very soon, or 2 years, 2 to 5 years, has been mentioned. But we always don't want to say to create false expectations.
Researchers want to find out what side effects, if any, the long-acting ARVs could have. The possible cost implications for such life-changing treatment are also still unclear. However, for millions, especially in Africa, where the majority of people with HIV and AIDS live, this development shines a ray of hope.
So long-acting to me, it's like that kind of boost or message to patients. Please, the few steps remaining, you're almost there, then you get that treatment.
It's another step forward in the fight against HIV and AIDS as the world searches for a cure. Wilkis Anyabwa, CGTN, in Kigali, Rwanda.
Well, Kista, tell us what more we should expect from the conference in the days ahead.
Well, in coming days, there are about 3 more days left before the conference wraps up. And in those days, we do expect to see just regional leaders, governments, and organizations recommitting themselves. Basically, these are the goals: to end HIV by 2030. But how? And so those are the discussions. Just how can different stakeholders and the delegates who are gathered here accelerate that process? What are the innovations they can use? What are the communication strategies that they can use? And how can they ensure that in the time left that they do meet this target, that they do bring down the numbers, and that they do basically ensure the well-being of their citizens? So these are some of the things that we expect, and we expect that by the time we get to the final day, that there will be recommendations on the way forward. People will recommit themselves, for example, to funding, because funding is a major facet towards reaching and achieving these goals. So we do expect that people will make commitments as to how they want to tackle this, given what they have learned from the successes of other people, from the failures of other people, and how they can carry on. So these are some of the things we are looking forward to finding out just what has made an impact on everyone while they're here. Lindy.
Indeed, those recommendations that will conclude that summit in 3 days' time will certainly have a far-reaching impact across the continent. Thanks, Wakista, joining us there live from Kigali, Rwanda. Now, South Africa's Human Science Research Council is currently hosting a number of high-profile delegates from the Chinese Academy of Social Sciences. CGTN's Yolisa Njamela has more.
The discussions at the symposium are meant to shed light on the cooperation on governance and socio-economic development between South Africa and China, to also reflect on the relationship between the two countries that has been nurtured over many years. The conference follows a resolution taken a year ago at the Forum on China-Africa Cooperation's Beijing Summit. That is where the Chinese President Xi Jinping announced that China would establish the China-Africa Institute to enhance and facilitate exchanges and cooperation with institutions in Africa. Ever since its inception, the Institute's main aims have been to deepen exchanges between the respective countries' civilizations and promote communication on experiences of governance and development between China and African countries. It also seeks to provide intellectual support for the construction of the Belt and Road Initiative.
To be a research base to organize collaborative research programs for policy suggestions and to facilitate China-Africa cooperation in Belt and Road construction. To be a hub to gather talents and train high-end professionals for China-Africa cooperation. And finally, to be a window to communicate the China story and China-Africa friendship and cooperation so as to enhance exchanges between China and Africa on civilization and development.
Delegates attending the Pretoria conference include scholars and experts at important research institutes and think tanks, as well as guests from government departments and business circles from both China and Africa.
As the largest think tank in China, Chinese Academy of Social Sciences willing to work with friends from the African academic community together the resources of China-Africa academic think tanks, promote mutual understanding friendship between the Chinese and African countries, and so that we can make suggestions and contribute to the development of China-Africa relations and the building of China-Africa community with a shared future.
The Chinese ambassador to South Africa told delegates here that China remains committed to a continuous working relationship with this continent.
For China, we're not a perfect country. We are still on the way to improve ourselves. But most important, we have the strong political commitment to work together with the continent. This continent has been rising. This continent is not sleeping. It's not only is rising. Last year, I'm proud to say, this continent have more than 17 countries have their GDP more than 5% growth rate.
During this year's conference, the exchange mechanism on the experience of governance between China and Africa will be launched. Under that mechanism, the two sides will organize thematic seminars, joint research projects, conduct training programs, and co-publish research outcomes. Yudison Jamela for CGTN in Pretoria, South Africa.
Let's take a short break. Here's what's coming up in your business news. The third CGTN Global Media Summit and CCTV Plus Video Media Forum opens in Beijing. And the International Conference on Sustainable Development and Sustainable Debt takes place in Dakar, Senegal.
Africa is the nexus of enterprise, and global business will tell you why it matters.
From the mega investment projects to multi-billion-dollar mergers and acquisitions.
Africa today collects, just in terms of revenues from taxes alone, $545 billion a year. If you take 10% of that and you devote it to the energy sector, problem solved.
All this on Global Business, weekdays at this time on CGTN.
Africa Live. Find your voice.
The third CGTN Global Media Summit and CCTV Plus Video Media Forum has opened in Beijing. Under the theme Media versus Technology, this year's gathering will explore new possibilities and disruptions brought by technology to the media industry. Bringing you up to speed with the latest from the event, here's CGTN's Wu Guxiu.
Co-hosted by CGTN and its content provider CCTV Plus and CGTNC, the summit welcomes 300 people from dozens of media organizations, tech enterprises, and think tanks from around the world. President Shen Haixiong of China Media Group calls on world media outlets to work for constructive contributions to global governance and human development.
Facing this complicated world, the function of global media should be constructive, not destructive. Media groups should push forward integration instead of intensifying disputes.
Shen launched the CGTN think tank, witnessed by 27 leaders of influential international think tanks. It aims to promote cooperation among global think tanks by building an open international platform for exchanges. Delegates from around the political world welcomed the move.
To sincerely hope and trust that the CGTN think tank, as a media institute, can not only develop guiding ideas to lead the trend, but also play an outstanding role in the process of deepening and expanding the understanding of China and the world by bringing together wise people from the world who care about China and the Chinese talents who are internationally minded.
Good information and insights, thoughtful analysis and debate, these are crucial, and these are delivered by CGTN and will in the future, I'm sure, be delivered by the new CGTN think tank. As a representative of, I would say, European citizens, wholeheartedly welcoming this important step and by looking forward to the future successful activities of your new CGTN think tank.
It's the third time that CGTN has hosted the summit, a platform for discussion among world media. This year, experts are addressing the unprecedented digital tech changes facing today's media. China Media Group says it has launched a 5G plus 4K and 8K plus AI strategy to effectively drive new media's development. It has opened the nation's first 4K channel and a first 5G-based new media platform, some significant steps in its media convergence. This afternoon, media and digital tech leaders are scheduled to explore the challenges and opportunities presented by the crossover of technology and broadcasting. CGTN think tank will also hold parallel discussions. While technologies change the way that media transmit their products, content is always at the core of what they have to offer. Wu Guoxiu, CGTN, Beijing.
Google Chief Executive Sundar Pichai will replace Larry Page as CEO of parent company Alphabet. This extends a long retreat from public roles and active management by Page and Sergey Brin at the company they co-founded 21 years ago. Alphabet said Page and Brin will remain directors, but they will give up their CEO and president titles with immediate effect. The company said the president role will not be filled, describing the changes as long discussed. Alphabet shares rose 0.64% following the after-hours announcement. Page, Brin and Pichai have all shared an emphasis on developing artificial intelligence software to speed up web searching and other tasks. Longtime product leader Pichai has increased efforts to make such technology available globally. But the vision faces unprecedented scrutiny. Governments on 5 continents are demanding better safeguards, less anti-competitive conduct, and more taxes from the world's largest online advertising company. Transmission Company of Nigeria has secured a $210 million funding from the African Development Bank. The financing is part of a $1.6 billion program. It will help the West African economy upgrade its failing electricity transmission and distribution network. With more on this, here's CGTN's Kelechi Emekalam.
Poor electricity supply. That's a major challenge for business owners like Raymond Unadike. For the past 17 years, keeping his printing business afloat has been a daily struggle. Raymond depends solely on his high-capacity generator to operate his machines. Several small, medium and large-scale businesses suffer the effect of constant power outages. Up to 50% of their earnings could go into running costly generators.
For the size of the generator I'm using, there is tendency for me to buy this up to 7,000, 8,000, 10,000 naira. Because I use a very big generator based on the size of my machines. They make it so expensive because something is supposed to do with 1 naira. Because of diesel, you ask more for more money. And customers, our clients are complaining.
Power generation has gulped over 80% of investments in the sector. Not as much attention has been paid to the transmission and distribution systems. In fact, more than 40% of electricity generated in Nigeria go to waste. Distribution companies lack the capacity to accommodate them. So the $210 million loan from the AFDB is much needed to begin a system overhaul.
First of all, to improve the electricity supply across these areas, these 7 areas, particularly from the south going to the north. I mean, south is where you have most of the good connections. If you go upwards to and up north, you see that connections are a bit sparse, and they are unable to get to the consumer. In the northeast region, the closest power plant, it's about 1,000 kilometers or 1,000 miles away, which is the Shiroro power plant. So there's obviously not enough access to these areas.
From an average 6,000 megawatts, Nigeria set a target to boost power transmission wheeling capacity to 10,000 megawatts by 2020 and 15,000 megawatts by 2025. The $210 million loan from the African Development Bank is just a fraction of what Nigeria needs to overhaul the nation's electricity system. The entire master plan could cost nearly $2.24 billion. It's estimated that over a period of 20 years, Nigeria would need to spend up to $100 billion to get its electricity right. Constant electricity is a prerequisite for economic growth and development, so the country is looking to the World Bank and several other sources to fund the massive electricity projects. Kelechi Amekalam, CGTN Abuja, Nigeria.
Time for a short break. Here's what's still ahead on the program. Coming up, how a South African artist is making an impact, one piece at a time.
How would you create your legend? On the fields, on the tracks, in the arenas of Africa. Were you born to be a player? Could this moment be yours? Sports Scene. Find your game.
As the world marks 16 days of activism against gender-based violence, the African Union and the United Nations have held discussions on the challenges faced by women and girls who are in forced displacement. The AU says the continent is home to 6.3 million refugees and asylum seekers and 14.5 million internally displaced people, half of whom are female. Colette Wanjoyi reports from Addis Ababa.
The 16 days of activism against gender-based violence began on the 25th of November. It is a campaign to respect the dignity and rights of all individuals without discrimination and violence. This year, the African Union and the United Nations are giving attention to the challenges faced by female refugees.
We are lucky to have got living testimony from 2 young refugees on some of the challenges that they encounter during flight and also during the process of getting asylum granted. And one of the things that stood out is the physical abuse, sexual abuse, and exploitation. And they encouraged us to look closely at this.
The African Union expects member states that host forcefully displaced people to offer them protection at all levels. The AU's Kampala Convention Treaty, adopted in 2009, lays out guidelines on the treatment of internally displaced people in Africa. However, the AU is concerned that almost half of the continent has not ratified this agreement. It says protracted conflicts around the continent, for instance in South Sudan, Mali, Libya and Central African Republic, continue to expose females to danger.
If you have a conflict, men are fighting or they can run away. It's difficult for women and young girls because as a wife, you cannot go without your children. You will try to protect them, then finally create problem. Or also in this conflict or terrorist attacks, men are the victim, they are killed, and we have more women and girls.
Uganda, one of the continent's biggest refugee host countries, says in order to empower female refugees, it is good to encourage them to be self-reliant.
Like we do in Uganda, we now try to prepare them to have some income-generating activities. And in Uganda, the women have done well. You can give them some little seed money, funds that can allow them to begin trading, while we also share with them the land, so that the fortunate thing in Uganda is that we have fertile land. They are able to produce some of not really all the food they need, but something to complement the relief that they get.
The 16 days of activism against gender-based violence campaign ends on 10th December, as the world marks the International Human Rights Day. But for the African Union, it is an ongoing campaign, especially as it seeks to support countries in conflict to silence their guns and bring a permanent end to the challenges of forced displacement. Colette Honjohi, CGTN, Addis Ababa, Ethiopia.
To the artistic space now, South Africa's Malose Phete started practicing his craft in primary school. As a young artist, he would make animal sculptures and illustrations in an environment where art classes were not that accessible. CGTN's Lindy Mtongana has more.
Galleries here in South Africa are still very specific and quite staid about the work that they don on their walls, and Maluse's one is quite unique. He's currently showcasing his work at Johan van Heerden's art gallery in Pretoria.
My exhibitions came from after I got my art degree. How it happened is that I sold artworks to a prominent collector, and then because galleries are catering to collectors, they figured perhaps maybe he has the market then. So with me and galleries, it's a collaborative effort. They are the business, I am the supplier. So we come together and then we cater for people who are looking for artworks.
So we visited Malose Phete in his studio in Johannesburg CBD and discovered that he's quite a versatile artist. His work dabbles in sculpting and painting and other forms of artistic expression.
My works originate from back when I was a kid, when I was young. I used to create a lot. I used to pick up clay from we have clay in the bush there. We pick up clay and you make little cows and cars, things like that. So, but then as I grew up, I figured I want to express this a little bit more. But I feel like art is a language.
Malose would later refine his artistic talent.
So after my matric year, I went to Tshwane University of Technology, and then I studied fine arts there. Yeah. And then with that, it gave me refinement. So now the thoughts that I had, the things that I was creating, now they came with sense.
We asked him about his motivation to produce this kind of artwork.
Sometimes I react to the environment, to what is happening. But most of the time, if ever I'm not getting external stimulation, then my natural thoughts are the ones that come, are the ones that are portrayed on my canvases. That's where you see the rural scenes, because most of the time, because I come from Limpopo, I come from Polokwane, we grew up there. So I create that. That's my natural imagery. When I'm sitting down, that's what's happening in my head. So then I put them on canvas, and then it makes sense. But then something sometimes happens, like the Fees Must Fall struggle, like the xenophobic attacks. And then that affects you so much that you feel like, I want to say something about this.
Malose has already done some large-scale artworks. Those include several mural projects at schools in and around the village from where he grew up. Lindy Mtongana, CGTN in Johannesburg, South Africa.
Here's what's coming up in your sports news. Marathon legend Eliud Kipchoge sets his sights on defending his title at the Tokyo 2020 Olympics.